So welcome to this Q&A. My name is Jan Meinema. I'm the program leader for the MA in sound design here at Baasbach University. And yeah, welcome to all the guests. Fantastic presentations. Really enjoyed them. Unfortunately, I had to miss parts of the last one, but yeah, really keen to get going. And so we have a question already for Andrew. Are you happy to answer this question, Andrew? Shall I read it out, or how would you like to do this? So,
sure. I don't mind. You want to read it?
Okay, yeah. So there's a question from Paul Jebenasma, who is my colleague here at Baasbach. So the new ways of thinking about audiovisual space discussed in your presentation seem to move beyond relationships governed by the syncresis and even beyond narrative cinematic definitions of the audiovisual medium. So do you think this enables audiovisual practice to encounter and respond to different kinds of subject matter? And how would these be experienced differently through a more spatial oriented approach?
Well, I think that in a way we already do this. This is the kind of thing that we already do with visual music and these more abstract forms of expression. I suppose what I'm interested in doing is breaking down and challenging these conventional theories, which have quite a limited kind of view on how the sound and image relationships work. And so I'm really interested in how we can apply the idea of space to better represent what it is that we are already engaged in doing. I think that all of us as artists working with sound and image probably work in this material way with the things that we are creating with, but that's not reflected in the way that people often write about what they're doing or have other people write about what they're doing. So I'm quite keen that we look towards spatiality as a way of explaining what it is that we're doing. And for me, I think it's really interesting because obviously the ways in which we think about our practice also influences the way in which we conduct our practice. And so the really interesting thing for me has been about challenging this binary way of thinking about sound and image. And I think lots of us struggle with this because we are generally thinking about sound and image together. It's audiovisuality, but the ways in which we think about it are often oppositional in a way.
Yes, during the presentation, I was also thinking of another link with that same issue about where in cinema we have the kind of Hollywood-driven film where it's very much narrative and time, sort of temporal based. Where if you think compared to Iranian cinema, or maybe even some Turkish films like Once Upon a Time in Anatolia, and these films are much more about the space and aesthetics of the film, where time is used in a very, very different way. Do you think that there's a link in that kind of way? You think,
Definitely. And one of the other avenues of my project actually is to work with a lot of Hollywood sound designers to discuss their practice with them and how they go about thinking. You may have heard that over the summer there's been a big movement in the film sound world to try and get credits higher up the credit list, because at the moment I think sound is listed below catering. Yeah. And they're really trying to be listed up after director of photography. They want to have all of the sound designer, sound recorder, sound mixer, all listed on a card higher up the list. And I think part of the challenge for them is that they're thought of as technicians, and this role, in the way that Hollywood does segregate these different roles, and talks about the sublimation of sound to image. You've kind of got the voice at the top, then you've got music, and then you've got other sounds. And of course, those divisions between music and other sounds is silly, as we all know, and being challenged all the time. But I think through working with them, I'm hoping that we can show that their creativity is just as valid as other forms. And if we can express that through using sonic, spatial ways of thinking, that hopefully it will help to add to that argument.
Great, thank you. There was another question for you, Andrew, but I
don't want to hog the whole thing.
I was just going to say maybe we should just move on and can get back to that. But there are a lot of technical problems on how to join the ad. Has anybody of you seen another question there? Because there seems to be a lot of problems with logging in. I don't know if Erin's still here. Don't know if she could do something about this. In the lack of another question, maybe we should go with that question at this point. And is that okay, Andrew? So along the same lines, can you speak to the communicative aspect of audiovisual music and how these aspects might evolve or reorient through a conceptualization of the field in spatial terms?
Yeah, well, I think that's really interesting, this idea of communication and how, I think, again, a lot of the literature is based around very kind of linguistic forms of communication, this idea of concrete meaning being transmuted through words or imagery. And of course, that doesn't fit with our abstraction in the sense that we're doing. Maybe we can communicate with people using abstract forms. I'm thinking as well of some of the ideas that John was mentioning about his kind of symbolic use of forms and shapes in his virtual worlds. This idea of there are multiple layers and different ways of communicating. And I think that at the moment, the literature encourages us to think about only a very limited forms of that sense of communication, because it can be through kind of much more affective ways that we can communicate with people. We can kind of communicate directly emotional states or impressions, I think. And I don't know whether John wants to dive in and say something about this, because I know this is something that you might like to say something about. Put you on the spot.
Yeah, I got to think now. Yeah, I think I'd sort of agree with that, really. I mean, my kind of understanding of a lot of sort of sound and music and some of the things they talk about in Inner Sound are very much along the lines of sort of seeing music in particular as being quite a kind of effective sort of force, really. And often my kind of thinking around the sort of pairing of sort of visuals and music is often that actually music is the almost like the kind of energetic or the emotional kind of driving force. And one of the things you can do with visuals is kind of frame different kinds of representational meanings around that emotional sort of driver. But obviously both can sort of do both, and there could be an interplay between them. And I think that's one of the things that's really interesting about sort of putting music and images together, is there's so much sort of potential in those explorations. But certainly with my own stuff, when I do things that are audio visual, they're different to what I'm trying to do when I do things that are purely sonic, in terms of what I'm trying to do with the sound. And it tends to be along the lines of thinking of music as this kind of emotional sort of force, really, and visuals being almost something that wraps around it, basically.
Thank you, John. There was another question actually to you. Do you see Cytodream as falling more in the category of a musical instrument tool, as a musical game, or as something more experiential, more in a combination of all? It's a question from Clovis.
Yeah, I think it's originally I kind of saw it as being basically kind of a composition, because it was kind of developing stuff I was doing in terms of sort of VJing and seeing what would happen if that was kind of moved into a sort of virtual reality context. So originally it's kind of like a DJ VJ mix in its form, and it's sort of conceived in that kind of way, really, where it's like it emerges as kind of a structure of different tracks that you fade between, which was kind of what I was doing in VJ sets before. But the sort of newer version, because originally this was on Gear VR, so it didn't have the sort of interactive component, because the Gear VR doesn't have good interactive controls, basically. So the interactive aspect is something I've been adding with the Oculus Quest, because you have the controllers there. But that's led me more into being interested in this idea of having sort of sound toys and being able to paint with sound in a sort of performative sense, and that giving a sort of a participatory aspect for anyone that tries it, basically. So I guess it's both in all of the things mentioned.
I was just wondering during the presentation, I was wondering how you see the relationship of the notion of authorship, of how much you, in a way, as a composer or as a creator, you give some authorship away to who's interacting with your instrument. So have you thought about that, of what the boundaries are of what you want to give to a listener or viewer?
Yeah, because I feel like, at least as it is at the moment, it's almost like the musical component is completely, or sort of the rhythmic parts with the kind of dance tracks and things are almost like a kind of backing track, and people can sort of improvise over that, and you can select between the different sort of sound toys and things. But obviously, they're providing sort of structures which I've designed, and they're designed in such a way that they'll fit with that kind of backing track. So they're kind of, anything that happens is operating within my my sort of compositional framework, if you like. But I think where I'd like to take it in the future would be probably one thing I wanted to do, because at the moment it's basically a sort of single player experience, to use the sort of game terminology. So what I'd like to have is kind of a multiplayer sort of networked version, where maybe there's some kind of arena that people can do this stuff in together, and you remove the backing track and you give people lots of different sort of sound toys to choose from, and then they can kind of construct this experience together, and also kind of utilizing the space that you have in that arena to do that as well. So it's one of the interesting things for me, is sort of coming from the sort of electric acoustic background as well, the potentiality with these kind of sound toys to be sort of painting abstract sound and things in sort of 3D space, and that having a kind of 3D positional component as well is interesting.
Thank you. We have a question actually from somebody about for the whole panel. So what are the essential characteristics of the technology you use and its relationship to the ideas you have about the content you create and the results you get? Do you think these are principles emerging, categorical principles that could be useful to tell us how to work with your system and understand it? Is there anybody that would like to?
I could field that one a little bit, because the whole festival that we organized was around basically one technological principle, which is the idea of working with vectors and working with signals that generate these specific kind of an image. So basically what you've got is a system where you've got either 2 or 3 channels, but you've got one point, and that point kind of moves around. And we can display it on things like oscilloscopes or lasers, like I talked about in the presentation. And we can listen to it by sending the same signals to speakers and things. So the kind of technological principle that comes through it is this reuse of, let's say, a discarded technology, because we don't actually look at computer displays very often using a vector display anymore, unless we happen to like really old computer art or really old video games. And this kind of synchronicity of image and sound, which is something that I think carries through our selection of stuff. Not always in the festival. Some things don't work on this kind of synchronous listen to the same sound, but quite a few of the artists that we brought into the festival and that approached us do want to work in that way, where you're seeing and hearing the exact same signal, and it's not a symbolic representation of one thing or the other. So that becomes very much an overall principle that guided us in selecting work for the festival and finding ways of packaging it together and presenting it. Also discursively trying to bring people in that were on the forefront of when this technology was really cutting edge, and bringing them into discussion with people who are using that kind of technology now. And that was really exciting. There were some really nice discussions in our panels, where we had people that were they were quite, to use the British colloquial, chuffed that we were getting in touch with them about stuff that they'd made 40 years ago, and that they thought was just ancient history or something like that. And then somebody comes and sends them an email, calls them up and says, hey, we want you to talk to people who are doing this stuff now and find you really fascinating. So organizing it around that one technological principle allowed us to expand out into all these areas of content and discourse that were really exciting. if that gives one sort of an overall principle. I think there's lots of principles that people can bring in through the technology of how they're working.
Yes, Trent, would you like to?
Hi. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, very good.
I think it's because I've started from theater as a lighting designer. So there's always home technology for some reason. So light, regardless whether that was analog or digital, is because that's the medium I first encountered. So I seem to have that as a reference point. So there is a simulation version, which I use things like Maya and Blender to think about light and conditions of light, but then in the digital space, that where I can try things out. For instance, one of the examples I've used was the turning actor's body into a flexible lens. So it allows so the technology allows me to be experimental, which is kind of beyond the threshold of what I have in home technology. So I always kind of return to where I started, and then simulation, and then going to conceptual experimentations, and that cyclic work seems to give me some fruitful explorations.
Yes, I was just wondering, Brian McKenna, welcome, by the way. You seem to make it in finally.
Yep.
Your work is very much based around technology, of course. Do you have any view on that question? I don't know if you've got the question actually this up.
Yeah, I saw the question, and I guess just this feedback between things like simulation or just imagining doing something and going through a process of developing or working with different technologies. I find it's this kind of rabbit hole effect of being sucked into a technological process. It can eat up years of your time, and sometimes you might even forget, well, what were the original aims? 3 years down the road, I invented the software, and what was I trying to do with it? And that sort of being a process in and of itself that might be separate from, well, making music, for example. So I've just been looking at specific technologies where I'm like, well, okay, I look up an old patch, it's 10 years old. I don't have a computer that can run it anymore. The technology's dead. You're entering into this archaeology process just to look at what you've done. So the kind of, what I like to call this sort of cult of innovation is quite curious in a way, because it feels almost like disease is maybe not the right word, but with the kind of constant mutation, it's like a adaptation to stress in a way that whether it's economic or whatever, a lot of reinventions are happening. And so I find it sort of difficult sometimes to wonder, okay, well, what's this process going to look like in 30 years? Is it still going to be possible to work with these tools? So yeah, just this kind of speeding up of innovation. It's just something I've become more curious about. Like, what does it mean to have a practice, and what's it going to mean, half a century from now?
Yeah, great.
So yeah, that's just why I've been leaning on this kind of end of the 1990s, early 2000s analog HD formats. Is they still work now. They've been supplanted by HDMI and digital and this kind of thing, but they are kind of accessible, and it is a different way of working and a different sort of relationship of control. I feel like what Ursula Franklin was saying about prescriptive technology and holistic technology, where certain techniques might kind of push you into this kind of prescribed role where you're a part of a bigger machine, but you're also you don't have an overview of the whole process, let's say. And in a way you never can, but I just like the idea you can sort of grab onto more aspects of the process so that you can be at least familiar enough to sort of understand what your role is. So as artists and designers, I just think like, well, okay, how much is going to be imposed on you by a process in terms of other aims. For example, in earlier panels it was brought up, well, we're generating a lot of data with our behavior, which is ultimately exploitable for economic means. So in terms of art and science, yeah, how much of what we do is for ideological reasons, possibly external to our own convictions. So
thank you, Brad.
Thank you.
A rhythmic pattern with your voice. You probably won't have heard it yourself, but is anybody else hearing this? I think so. Actually, there was a question that Andrew had for Brian. That's Brian with the Y. Would you like to ask it yourself? Sorry?
Oh, yeah, no. Well, I actually just stole, I think it was Clovis who asked John, and I was just intrigued actually to hear Brian's response to this question of whether his piece falls more into the category of a musical instrument or tool, or as a musical game, or something that's more experiential. Because I think it's really interesting when you place people with the headset and they're there, they become part of it in a way. And I'm really interested in this blurring between a game and an instrument, and whether there is a distinction.
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I suppose there's elements of each one, elements of a piece, an instrument, a game, an experience. So the user themselves have the ability to create the mappings, create their own mappings, judged by their own perception of what they think works or not, so in that way it is. And then you train the neural network, and then you actually play the instrument in the space with your movement. So in that element, in that regard, it is an instrument, but also a composition, because you're composing. You are deciding on the audio and visual perceptual pairing to go with your particular movement. In terms of a game, it has elements of a game as well, because it's discoverable. Also, there's discoverable elements. So you might train the instrument to react in a certain way with a certain pose, and then another pose like on the opposite side of it, and then on the left side of it. But between these points, there's unknown mappings that are going on that you then explore. So in that way, it's kind of, you're discovering these mappings. During the demo that I showed, I got a few comments back that it was, some people found it very meditative. So they were in this, so the environment is basically just an infinite plane, ridged plane, and there's a gigantic sun. So it's quite, it's a bit surreal, but it's also, there's like a wind sound. So you're kind of just in this massive expanse with this strange object. And I think some people found it very meditative. So yeah, I think working with VR is, yeah, it's still, it's quite, it's hard to, it's definitely an emerging space in where you don't really know what the finished product is really, in a way, and it's, yeah, I think there's a lot of exciting work to be done to develop it as a medium in itself.
Thank you. Yes, also I saw that Scooby has also managed to join us. Welcome. There were a lot of questions earlier in the YouTube. I think when your presentation was going on the YouTube chat, that there were some very great reactions there. Did you want to perhaps comment on the earlier question on technology, if you remember what the question was? What are the essential characteristics of technology you use? And I know your work is a part research based, of course, but have you got any thoughts on that?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, really the presentation was about my great uncle Ben's, his process and his work. I mean, it was, I don't think I actually mentioned it or went in depth about it, but his, I think one of the reasons for developing the oscillons was to create, like a new visual language for his commercial practice as well. And that's when he started exploring like the harmonographs and the pendulum tracings. And so he realized that he had to, create or use this pre-existing technology in a new way. So he taught himself how to build the circuits, and then he explored, breaking away from the Lissajous patterns, and then really figuring out how to, how to draw and kind of sculpt with his system. It's like that initial, like reading, and I think in like popular science about the possibility of using oscilloscopes in a creative way. And then he pursued that for his whole career.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. There are some more questions popping in, and I have one that I'm trying to trace somewhere, but on my list. But here is this is a very specific question. But has anyone thought about how to replace those representations of Oculus controllers with something more visually appealing? This is from Barry Moon.
I have an answer to that, actually. Yeah, I've in my piece, I'm using the default ones at the moment, but I've been playing around with kind of things that look like instruments. So I had one which kind of looks a bit like a trumpet that will sort of shoot all this stuff out. And I was quite interested in the holophoner in Futurama, basically, as kind of a model for this kind of thing. So yeah, I'm quite keen on the idea of sort of maybe things that look a bit like sort of traditional instruments, but maybe sci-fi versions of them, and exploring that. And obviously we can in Oculus Rift, you can have sort of representations of your hands and things because you've got hand tracking and stuff now. So there's lots of possibilities, but yeah, more to explore, I guess.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to respond to that? Brian, perhaps? Or?
Yeah, it's another area of exploration. I think your representation of your body within the virtual world is a whole other it's a whole thing to consider, with many implications for presence and self. Yeah, a lot. I imagine it's a very deep thing to get involved with. But yeah, I suppose my piece, I also just had the default trackers, but I would love to, I think in the future, include a full avatar where if you look down, you see a body, rather than two floating controllers. I think that would increase your perception of being in the space, possibly increase it. But yeah, sorry, I'm starting to ramble now. So
one of the things that is quite interesting in the sort of the experience of one of the scenes that I have, you have got these kind of waves of cubes that are sort of oscillating and they're moving through your body, and it creates a weird kind of bodily sensation. when you experience that and you feel a bit like you're on waves or water or something. And it's those kind of things which are sort of unexpected when you're sort of playing around with VR. And it's okay, there's actually kind of quite a unique feeling that accompanies that you don't necessarily get with other sort of mediums. So yeah, so there's sort of interesting things in relation to the body there. And I've seen some other cool things where people have done stuff with sort of having sort of particle effects coming from where your body is and things. So you have a sort of spectral representation of yourself in VR. And I think those things are kind of interesting too.
Yeah, that strikes me as something that kind of blurs this distinction between the body and the materials, because I'm thinking of Fred's tool. I know obviously they're physically there, but they're, in a way, as far as I was interpreting, people are interacting with the screen, with the graphics on the screen themselves. So in a way, they're touching the material directly, rather than having this abstracting layer of a tool in the way.
Right, there's some of both there. That's correct. They're both interacting with the physical, the screen space, and there are layers below that where they're interacting with with lumis, with these abstract structures that have colors and shapes and patterns of motion and so forth. And so it calls on both pieces.
Because I was just thinking back to Moira's question about tools and technology, and I was thinking, for me, actually, when I'm working creatively, what I'm trying to do is make the technology as transparent as possible. So I want to get as close to the material that I'm working with as possible, whether that's a sound material or whether, in more recent pieces, whether it's visual material. I've been trying to eliminate the technology in a way, make it transparent, so that it's just about that material experience. I'm interested in how that is then manifest in the VR world. I know that the panel previously were talking a lot about that embodiment in that space. I think it's a really interesting area to explore.
Actually,
it's funny that you say that kind of getting the technology out of the way makes it transparent, because my interpretation of transparent is exactly the opposite, that if you're using a tool, that tool is kind of shaping your experience, and you should be able to look into that tool and see it for what it is, actually, rather than hide it behind the wizard's curtain. Always, when you get into these very physical instruments, or these instruments that are kind of exploded all over the table and invite you to kind of come in and have a look at it, rather than it be just a black box, which something goes in and some creative process happens inside that black box and something else gets spit out the other side. I think actually opening that black box up is the transparent part. It's of course a difference of terminology. So
yeah, the word changed. The word changed. Its meaning almost inverted. Its meaning during the growth of personal computing, the movement of computers from back rooms to people's homes and desks. And transparency originally meant you could see everything inside. All of the ROMs were documented and you could get your hands on and the boards. And then it became, you can see right through it. It's, it's just a piece of glass. That's what transparency in computers became, is that you didn't need to know anything. You couldn't see anything, even if you wanted to know. And I think there is this interesting challenge with even the very notion. And I think we're hitting a similar wall with the very idea of embodiment. What is embodiment? Is it that we lose track of where we really are, or that we become wholly, aware of where we really are? I mean, it used to mean you were in touch with your body, and it's now coming to take on this sense that the body becomes sort of merged with, the other. And
I just wanted to say something about that, Fred, because I mean, this idea, it was conceptualized as the coal cellar and the parlor. So a computer is the coal cellar, where you put all the wires and the parlor is where the user uses the computer. But now we are kind of going into this disembodied image. If you look at the flat screen, the edge gets smaller and smaller until it's just this sort of floating image, and then we're kind of obliged to fall into the image in a way, but we do forget about, or we're obliged to forget about all the junk behind that, or not junk, but all the functional elements, all the modules, all the labor behind this. And yeah, it's a curious sort of development in a way, and in terms of how we experience art and music with our bodies, or with a kind of simulated experience. I mean, it's a bit of an open question, but yeah, I sort of wonder about like where the future is going, and what the kind of backlash or reactions to a more virtualized experience is going to be. Like, neo-primitivism, for example. Just wanted to react to what you were saying there.
Thank you.
In music, we already had that, because we went from somebody, with a little very sterile laptop on the stage and nothing else going on, to these exploded instrument modular kinds of things, or these handmade circuits and things like that that are exactly this reaction against this very sterile in the machine sort of thing, and kind of bringing it back to this physical level.
I also, thinking about the time of it, we will have to wrap up in 7 minutes. So I've got one sort of major question, but it's to the whole panel. This is from Brian Smith. So from all theoretical perspective, from a theoretical perspective, there seems to be many connections between the works you create and or the research, and Derrida's logic of supplementarity, insofar as language and speech presuppose gesture. To what extent do you think of your work, or aspects of your work, in terms of gesture, visual gesture, sonic gesture, and composite audio-visual gestures, etc., whether communications or purely aesthetic? Anybody like to respond to that question?
Well, I think, I want to key off of Derek's observation. I think gesture is where it's at for audiences. If you're creating in front of an audience, that's where all the clues come from about the why of what you're doing. And I think instrument design really craves being being conceptualized gesturally. So
I think as well, that's kind of what I meant when I was talking about transparency, is actually this direct connection with gesture. So this challenge of trying to, I work with computers a lot, and I do have some fun synthesizers that I play with as well, but this challenge of when you've got your Pro Tools or whatever system you're using, that gets completely in the way of those gestures, right? You can record things and you can have gestures, you can move things around and you capture a gesture, but so often you put it into the computer and it gets flattened somehow. So you have to kind of try and bring that gesture back out. And so for me, it's about, when I'm saying about transparency, it's about trying to get back to those gestures and make those gestures as vivid as they are to me when I experience them, when I'm recording them or in the studio. And I guess that's the exciting thing about modular, is that you can be controlling the signal directly and you can articulate and perform those gestures in real time. And a way, that's what you have to do in the studio as well, I guess.
The little clip at the end of my talk where Catherine, this person who's playing Imager for the first time, where she begins to do this movement several times, to me, that was really an exciting moment as an instrument designer, was to see her. She didn't have to do quite that. She could have done something quieter and more, but it showed me, as an instrument designer, it showed me that I want to draw that out because the audience loves that. And I think that's another sense of transparency in instrument design is.
I wanted to say about gesture, just working with the technology, like this old, rabbit ear antennas, and when it wouldn't work properly and you're trying to tune it, and people could tune it by, okay, stand over there, and then it sort of, you know, these strange gestures of the body come out that would be unintended. It's quite strange. And I've noticed it with this kind of VR goggles, people working with four-dimensional space, you know, and you see what they're doing and the way they move is just completely like you would never imagine doing that with your body at all. So in terms of language presupposing gesture, yeah, I mean, you know, technology as a language, if you can call it that, it does cause some quite interesting non-typical movements and gestures in terms of, okay, how can we, yeah, how can we navigate this environment? So it's almost more like environment than language in a way, or the feedback between these things. I hope that approaches the question, Brian.
If I can just come in on that point as well. I think in my own stuff, there's kind of a sort of a painting metaphor in play with a lot of it, because I sort of paint and I import kind of actual bits of paintings as sort of backgrounds and things in my stuff. And then the sort of metaphor I'm using with the sound toys is kind of painting with sound. So that obviously kind of implies a sort of gestural component, but I think it's only sort of one thing that I'm interested in there, and there's lots of other things as well.
Great, thank you, everyone. We're sort of nearing the end of this chat. Just wanted to say to everyone that the panel 4 section is starting at 6 o'clock later on. So there is a little bit of a break, I believe. But thank you all so much to all the panel members to be here and answer questions. Thank you also for wanting to reply to these questions in detail. And any last thoughts of anybody? There was one question from Andrew, actually, for Scooby about the colored oscillons. Were they captured as individual colored exposures and layered?
Actually, it was just one exposure. As the oscillon was being formed, the color wheel would spin at whatever particular RPM, and then it was just captured. So there's no dark room, no extra work in the dark room, like no layering of the negatives or anything.
Amazing, yeah. Well, they're amazing anyway. Incredible images.
Thank you all. Thank you all very much for joining, and might see you all in the other session at the panel 4. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.